So it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm so happy we have this community where we can actually do math and theory in biology at this interface. So that's a little bit my own sort of life history, just in a way of introduction, is a bit about that. I'm a theoretical physicist by training. That's why I see the world through theory, and theory implies also mathematical theory and models. You'll see that today a little bit in biology. But I used to joke a little bit to the physicists, I hope you forgive me, that I had this kind of problem that, I'm a physicist, but I love people. And so how can I bring these two things together, in my life? So I went through the field of complex systems, which is many things to many people, but it's a field that's very vital. There's a lot of people thinking about, in general, how do we look at complex systems and model them. And as part of that, a lot of my activity, and the reason why I came to University of Chicago in the first place, is that I developed a lot of work in the context of understanding cities, models and theory and so on. So that's my book. It's not a plug. It's just to tell you I have this other life out there. But as I was writing this book, which is mostly, a mathematical theory of cities and therefore social life in complex environments, the last chapter was what tripped me, which was really about what I wanted to be writing about is a problem that's been with us in society, but also in biology for a long time, which is the problem of growth. Where does growth come from? So people in cities and society often think about economic growth, right? And the answer that is given, but it's not very mathematical or predictive, is that growth comes from information, from new ways to use resources, factors of production, as I said, to do new things. Okay? And so where's the information, right? So that's an important question. So in general, okay, echo is terrible. So that problem was there for a long time for me in general terms, and it's the theme of what I want to tell you about today. I'm also, as you can see, a professor of ecology and evolution. A lot of my work went through mathematical modeling of evolution, biological systems, a lot of epidemiology, but questions of information also come there. So let me ease into that a little bit, but I just wanted to declare a little bit my bias as to where I'm coming from and a little bit what I'm looking for, and I'll tell you more as I go. Okay, so this is work with Jordan Kemp, who's over there. So you can ask him lots of hard questions, and he's already made some of the figures that I'm going to show you a little bit better and so on, but we're about to post this paper, so hi. We're about to post this paper, so we're just kind of fixing some typos and so on, so if you're interested, let us know. And the other person is Brandon Grandison, who's, so Jordan is here with us today, fortunately. He just graduated from physics, from the physics department with a PhD from Chicago, and is now at Oxford University. And Brandon Grandison is a PhD candidate in our program of ecology and evolution. And Brandon is interested in problems of ecological structure and information theory and a few other things. Okay, so here's where I want to start. So these are two quotes from famous people in biology, but you could have found many more quotes. Schrödinger is very famous for saying something like this a long time ago and so on. But so what these two quotes are a little bit about is this, I'm going to call it biology's dual nature. This is a well-known thing, which is about energy flows and information. The novelty is information, because we have energy flows in physics and systems that we understand very well. But we don't really understand information that well. So here comes again. In society, it's very complicated, but there's also the question of how we understand it in biology. We talk about information all the time, right? The genome, this and that. But can we actually say what it is, measure it, and see its predictions? That's really what I'm trying to ask. And so, as you can see, these two quotes also make the case, for example, that the gene is not merely a unit of heredity, of, if you will, information that's passed on. It's a unit of information, a set of instructions for the construction and maintenance of life. So it's an active process that's actually taking signals in and adapting and doing lots of things. Or the other quote, it's not a static repository of information. Barbara Macklin taught, of course, transposons and a lot of the dynamic nature of the genome. It is a dynamic, responsive system that interacts with the environment. It is this interaction that allows life to adapt and evolve. So I won't say a lot about energy flow because it's kind of better known, though it's implicit, and I'll point to it as I go. But I want to tell a little bit more about this issue of information. And, in some sense, where it comes from and how do we understand it. So I want to start with very simple math. Now, this talk, of course, will have a lot of math and theory. But that's why we're here, right? So, but I hope that as I go, Almost everything I do is pretty clear. I like to keep things as simple as possible, even as the math builds up a little. And so I'll try to be maybe painfully didactic, try to tell you what each thing means for a diverse audience. So this is one example, very simple slide to get us started. So the idea is that when we actually look at population genetics, the kind of modeling that most people do, this is kind of just trying to set up sort of a straw man of what is the standard thing that people do. But there are always exceptions, and there are people that do other things. But we think of a population, maybe of some size n, could vary in time, and it's divided into some types. I'm just going to call it n of s, okay? So some phenotypes typically, but it could be genotypes, whatever you want to think about. And so that they add up to n. And then typically what we write, sort of the first thing, thank you, almost the first thing that shows up in any classical book like Crow and Kimura is something that looks a little bit like this, which is that the number of the population size in type S at some new time is equal to the population of the previous time times this factor, and this factor is the fitness of type S. With the idea, therefore, that if this fitness is 1, basically it's neutral because the population size is maintained, but if it's greater than 1, it gets amplified, so the type grows, it's said to be fitter, and if it's less than 1, it declines, okay? So, and this then is written in very simple terms, in terms of relative sizes of these populations. So it's just dividing the size of the population of type S by the full population each time. And so this is just basically the ratio of the fitness of the type over the average fitness over types. There it is. But it's averaged over the present population distribution in type S. And this is the relative fitness. And it's usually the thing that we gotta stop and say, this is what we want to optimize. It's the relative fitness that should be maximized, and that's what it means, okay? So a couple of things are interesting, and you all know this, but is that this is kind of a probability estimate telling us what's the probability of finding an individual type S in a population of size n. And so fitness is defined in this way as reproductive success. But where's the argument? Fitness is supposed to be adaptation to an environment. Where's the environment? Would this be different if I put the population in a different environment? Yes, right? So it's not there. And this is a problem, right? Because it should be a problem. It's obvious, but it should be a problem. So we want to put it there. By the way, just to say this, and then I'll want to speak about energy and so on, but obviously if a population is growing, it's getting more energy flow to sustain those individuals. So this is also a way, fitness is related to obtain those energy flows from whatever the population is feeding on. Okay, so I just want to also introduce this, I'm going to use it later. So usually we think of fitness in the way I just described. There it is, the first line. But then it's also useful to think of growth rates, which usually are obtained in the continuum, or when we think about this as basically a path integral, a process by which the new population is equal to e to the growth rate over some time tau. And so this means that the growth rate is 1 over tau. I'm going to set tau to 1 in a moment, but it's the logarithm of the fitness, and this can be expanded if the fitness is close to 1 to first order and so on. So usually this is often assumed that the relative growth rate, relative to the average of the population, goes like the type of the relative fitness minus 1. So under weak selection, usually we can make these expansions, but this is not always true. And it's not true when you have fluctuations. To second order in the series expansion wouldn't be true, right? And those are fluctuations of the growth rate. It's kind of interesting, but these two quantities go hand in hand. They often, sometimes we say we're optimizing one, sometimes you're optimizing the other. Because of these relationships, obviously they're monotonic, and maximizing one is maximizing the other. That's just for future use. Okay. So there are several issues with the definition of fitness as reproductive success. So this is pretty obvious, but it's important to say it, right? Because we are supposed to be theoretical people that think in principal ways. The first one is that it's circular and incomplete. There are several papers written about this. It's circular because it already says you've been successful. It doesn't explain how you've been successful. And it's incomplete, as we said, because it does not refer to adaptation to an environment, which is what the word fitness literally means. Okay. Then there are other questions that are a little bit just nagging that we always kind of shut up and calculate, but that it's important sometimes to ask them. How is fitness to be averaged over many generations? Can I do it over, can I average over a population sometimes or not? How do I take care of heterogeneities and so on? This is sometimes called the mismatch problem. And people think about this basically as a pure problem. Just think about, sometimes they talk about short-term fitness versus long-term fitness, or state, or sometimes accidental, that may be a population that's in circumstances that favor its growth, but they may not be fit. So there's this issue of noise and fluctuations and what actually fitness is when the dust settles. I'm just putting that there because this always comes back in some way. And then there are other related issues, which one is, for example, how does fitness compose? So if I have two things that influence fitness, should I expect that they add up in fitness? Simple question. Most people in many situations assume so, that often we can get away with a linear combination like this. And this is often justified, again, by some Taylor expansion series or something, who's just linearizing whatever it is. But this is usually not true. Fitness does not compose in a way that is additive, and I'll show you later. And there's a certain lack of clarity in mathematical studies. For example, there's a vast literature in kin selection, group selection, game theory, altruism, about how to identify conditions for evolutionary strategies to emerge. And so there's a lot of this that's done numerically that's hard to disentangle. Yes?
S. So S is a trait, and now...
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I wasn't... Yeah, so exactly. So you could have a vector of traits, and I was not being very precise with the math, but yeah, they could have many things. I'll show you examples later that are explicit. Okay, so these problems are kind of nagging, right? If we cannot kind of have total clarity on this, how we go about it. So a solution to some of these problems have been proposed. Some of this is basically based on a very simple mapping. If you're a mathematician, this is normal. Which is the mapping of the kind of frequency update to the population. If you take this seriously as a probability, then you're kind of stuck with the fact that this looks a lot, in fact, must be a version of Bayes' relation, because it's just probability. So, if it's probability, then it has to have this mapping. So there's a sort of a duality here, if you will, if you want to use a fancy word, but there's a mapping to Bayes' theorem. And so I'm just going to say what Bayes' theorem is. I suppose that everyone here knows, but it's just it's an identity on conditional distributions. But it's used in inference in the sense of starting with some probability in some space, usually called hypothesis. You can update that probability given evidence, given data, and this update follows from just the laws of conditional probabilities, but involves essentially a likelihood function. This P of D given H has a very special status because it is something you need to provide. It's a model of what data you should actually observe given the hypothesis. Okay, so it's a little bit, if we can use that word today, everyone's using it, it's a bit of a generative model, right, for the data if I believe in my hypothesis. If I have a different hypothesis, I'll have different data. Okay, so this is kind of interesting and important, right? And so, and of course, the P of D is a normalization, as I think you know. But so I just wrote it here in terms of S's and E's. So S as some type label, and the E is now the environment. Okay? So there's something, so the way to read this is that I started with some population, and then it lived in the environment. It was affected by states of the environment. And what I get afterwards is a population given what just happened in the environment. Okay? So usually this is a more specific state of the population because the environment did something to it. And this now requires, just like that, a probability of the environment given each type. Okay, and again, the normalization is not very important. And so what this does is to create a definition of fitness that looks like that. So it should be obvious that you should have the P of E given S. So this is now a little generative model for what the type thinks the environment is. It's cool, right? It's informational. Here, there's no reference now to population growth, actually. Interesting, right? It's all about how good the model is. In a moment, I'll show you. And this A of E is important, and it's necessary because because fitness can be greater than 1. So we'll get to that in a moment. And I'll just define for future reference that the average fitness over types, as I've done before, can then be defined this way, and it's just this A times the probability. So what this is the probability estimate for the state of the environment across all types, weighed by the current type distribution. But this is an estimate that the population as a whole has of the state of the environment. It's not the real thing. It's just an estimate based on the types and the likelihoods. Okay? So it combines the models that each type has with the frequencies, and this is kind of like what the population, if you had to ask the population, which we'll do, this is what it can tell you about this, what the environment looks like. Okay. So this is all just mapping one thing to another, which is what mathematicians often like to do, which is good. But I hope it's a little thought-provoking. Play with it a little bit, because it's interesting. I've been playing with it for a few years. But let's just say a little bit more. So the factor of A, I already got a little bit ahead of myself, is important because fitness in general can be larger than 1. So that factor needs to be there, and we'll see what it is in a moment. Well, this actually explains it. And so this also defines an instantaneous growth rate, which is just I took the time scale to 1 for simplicity. So it's just a log of the fitness. And so it has these two terms. Once I put the log, things add. And I just wrote it in a somewhat different way there at the end by putting a P of E and a P of E downstairs. So P of E is the real distribution of the environment. The real environment has some distribution. Okay? And so now about averaging. If I iterate the dynamics, right, the replicator equation or the Bayesian dynamics over time, then what I get is that, I don't think I have to do it explicitly, you get that these factors multiply in time. Are you asking a question? Should I just finish the argument? Okay. So you get something like this with E for each time. This is assuming some sort of stationarity that you can, well, you can always do this, but then if there's some stationarity, the law of large numbers tells you that this is an average over the states of E. I can trade that for the average in time, and I get something like this. And for the aficionados of information, if you don't care about that, this just, you can take it like that. But this is basically a bunch of informational quantities as a log of A, sets the magnitude of growth. This is just average over E. There's an entropy of the environment, which actually costs you. If you are in a more complicated environment, this actually reduces the growth rate. This is well known in other statistical models. And then this last term, which is the only one that has S in it, the type in it, says that because it's negative and this quantity is positive, it's a Kullback-Leibler divergence or relative entropy, it means that the type that has the best model of the environment when this is the same is the one that grows the fastest. So that's kind of cool. It just says that the best model wins of the environment, okay? So, so there it is. Okay, yes? It's always statistical in all these constructions. It's not necessarily stationary, but if it's very variable on the time scales that we're considering, then you're going to have a problem because you cannot adapt to it. So there has to have some, usually has to have some regularity that you can effectively learn it, adapt to it through this dynamics. Yeah, then there's nothing to explain. That, I think a constant environment doesn't exist. Right, yeah. So so what you see here is that essentially, go back to the fitness for a moment. There are models like this that have been developed actually in theory of gambling and markets and a bunch of other places in almost pure stats. But the idea here is that for the state of the environment E that's going to come up now, you have a reward A. Right, so what we're actually looking at is not the entire environment, which is a scary thing that's enormous, but typically you have to be looking at degrees of freedom in the environment that can give you a fitness boost. So there's sort of a process there that I wasn't explicit about. And so you have to discover what those are, and those are not typically going to be constant. They're things that happen. Grass grows in a place, not another, whatever. But I can't be quite that explicit. I'll do some other examples that are a bit more mathy. Yes?
Interaction between the different S.
I'll get there, but
I thought that was in the environment. So I thought for each species we have an environment which is constructed by the other species, and so that's why
Yes, but not always. So I appreciate your question. So in a moment, I'll take you through a bunch of examples. And the logic of those examples, I'll repeat myself then, is that you can consider, just following your question, an environment that's just physical out there and has some statistics. That's the simplest case. In that case, it doesn't do what you're saying. But then you can think about game theory or strategic interactions or stuff like this, where the environment becomes entangled with the agent. And I'll show you that too. But we have to build up to it. Okay? Yeah. Well, the only thing that really, the only approximation here, I mean, it's all just math, but the only approximations go from what is experienced is that the population exists in the environment and gets exposed to different states of the environment as it goes. So you get basically a product of the fitness over these times, which means that in the log fitness, or the growth rate, this is actually looking like the log of this, right? Which is then essentially the average sum of the logs, which is our informational quantities. So it's in going from the time average to the state average, which is what usually the law of large numbers gives you, and the conditions that the law of large numbers applies. But in that point, there's an approximation. It's likely that any real population cannot learn all about the environment in the exposure that it has, and maybe the environment is also changing and so on. So there are issues of time scales and convergence and so on that would be under that. Okay, so those are very good things, but I want to show you a few things we can do with this without, I'm going to bring those back as open problems, obviously. But some of them are open problems of a certain technical nature, which may be important, and some are more fundamental, I think. So I'll try to tell you at least my thoughts about that. Okay, and the last part of this is that, so it's the same thing, okay? But now there are a couple things. So this is what I just showed you, this line. So this is still the growth rate of S, but over a longer time horizon. But then I can also average this over the posterior, which means basically I'm averaging over the new state of the population. Okay, so now I'm averaging over the types, because this is not yet an information, mutual information. So when I do that, go through this, but basically you obtain the mutual information between the entire population across types and the environment. So as you observe sort of the averages of these growth rates, and there are several averages that you have to be careful with these F's and P's and so on, then you basically are seeing that these growth rates are telling you something, telling you about how well adapted in units of information the population is to its environment. But each type is basically has its own model, and then there's sort of an average over the models that each type represents as well. That gives you then the full mutual information. Okay, so in this sense, which is specific, you can see that evolution is a learning process, just like iterative Bayes is a learning process, essentially. But it's doing it in populations with types, and each one of these types, at least from an informational lens, from its dual lens of looking at it as information, is a bit of a model of the environment. And what you have is competition of models to represent this environment as well as possible, and the ones that do well are amplified and the other ones die, or at least de-amplified. By the way, there's sort of a sense of maximization that's asymptotic, but it's not there yet. Okay, so Jordan made this picture. It's a bit just showing what it is. And part of the point to your question before is that these environments can be maybe physical, ecological, or biological, and social. And we'll get to some of the social ones in a moment. But at the end of the day, there's essentially the iterative dynamics. You know that Bayesian iteration essentially gives you asymptotically maximum likelihood. It picks basically the state that maximizes the likelihood. And the translation here is that the iterative dynamics chooses the state or subset of states that maximizes the information on average. Okay. So just a summary for this part, and now we're going to go to examples where maybe things will become clear, maybe not. But so evolution is a dynamic learning process in the sense I just described. It changes phenotype distributions to best incorporate data or evidence from the environment and predict the environment. These, I think, should be seen as you know, when you look at an organism, it's a prediction for the environment it's going to be in. It has something about, you know, it being wet or dry or something, right? It has a prediction. And that's kind of interesting. It puts, in the spirit of the quotes I started with, it puts fitness and the genotype in this more active role, more generative role. Okay. Now, these other 2 points are a bit more technical, but are important. Because fitness is a probability, factors typically multiply. So this goes to a question you're starting to raise, and we'll do more of this. But I just want to raise the point, and then you'll see examples, and we can keep going. But if you had basically several of these types, you can also have environments that are kind of complicated and have independent parts and so on. But typically, if there's conditional independence, this means that the probability, so it's already a simplification, okay? It means that the probabilities multiply, okay? So they don't add up in the fitness, right? It's probabilities. But in the log fitness, they do, right? This is why we have informational theoretic quantities. In some sense, they're built to disentangle statistically independent factors. This only happens in the log fitness and by approximation in the fitness. But this allows you, in principle, to consider independent contributions if you analyze the log fitness, and allows you to not be under the assumption of weak selection, which is what allows you to do that first order expansion. But in general, that's not true. So sometimes this doesn't matter. But if you really cared about the fact that there may be interaction effects and so on, you really should be careful, because this gives you a principled way to actually look at things that may be statistically independent contributions. It's very important, for example, in machine learning, that you actually get that right. Otherwise, it's all entangled. It's a mess. OK, so that was that first part that makes the general argument. And now I want to show you some examples of how this is used. The spirit of the examples, they're all going to be purely analytic. And part of the point, so Jordan's done, and Brandon's there in the back too, so there he is. They've done some numerics and dynamics and so on, but what I'm going to show you is purely analytic. And part of the point is that if some of you, like me, have a background in physics, the log fitness under average, of course, is an information, but as you'll see, also looks a little bit like an effective potential. So you can actually start describing phase transitions and phase diagrams and a bunch of things that we know from other fields may be important here. And so, and you can do this, at least under the conditions I'm going to show you, fully analytically. OK, so I have 4 examples. The first one, so they build up. The first one is called task selection in a stochastic environment. So the population needs to choose a type that aligns well with the stochastic environment. The second one is evolutionary game theory. It's a big field, but I'm just going to analyze the usual, which is the prisoner's dilemma. The novelty here is that you can do a lot of the analysis completely analytically, and the conditions for cooperation to emerge and so on become expressed not so much in things you put in a simulation or preferences, but in terms of statistical quantities that you can understand what they are, and then perhaps they have a specific meaning in a biological or social situation. Then I'll tell you about mixed games. So this is when the population is not playing just the prisoner's dilemma, but it's playing two games at the same time, which is kind of interesting. We just did this because we could. And it came up in Brandon's defense of his proposal. And then I'll show you about selection in groups. This is not quite group selection. Okay, it's meant to be different. But it shows you that once you have group structure, you can have, obviously, that label influencing how it's selected. And so I'll give you a few examples. And again, the problem you asked will come back in full force there. It's a little bit more technical to do that. But OK. So task selection so there's an environment. And so this is a very simple environment. It just has zeros or ones. In most of these examples, that will be the case. So it's a discrete distribution. And so the task is labeled also S01, whether it's aligned with the environment or not aligned. So the idea here is that there's a reward. The plus is greater than minus. There it is. And so it's better to be aligned with the environment than misaligned with the environment. It's all it is. But the environment's probabilistic. So the population needs to, in some sense, figure out how to distribute itself. That's all. It's a very simple case. It's been treated many times. And my intention here is to show you that you can treat this in simple terms. So the way to write the fitness here is very simple. It's like this. So there are four possible states, right? The four combinations of S and E. And when you combine them together, you basically have two terms that go with payoff y plus and y minus. So basically, these are the two aligned terms, as you can see, aligned, and aligned at 0 and aligned at 1. And these are the two cross terms, which means that the log fit, so this is a stochastic quantity. Part of the point that's interesting about this is that defined like this is also true in Bayesian applications, that first quantity depends on E, and E is going to be fluctuating, right? So that's a stochastic quantity to begin with by construction. And so then the log fitness is also a stochastic quantity, but it's just this, very simple. So the beauty of this, as you'll see repeatedly, is that the log fitness, because most distributions are exponential of something, of a polynomial, the log fitness is a polynomial. I mean, there are exceptions like extreme value theory and so on, but it becomes very simple. So it's relatively easy, very easy many times, to take averages of the log fitness now, okay? So that's the log fitness. And then the average log fitness, now I have to introduce a bit of math, can be written this way. So this is just that F11 is, it's here, is the frequency of S is equal to 1, and Q, and this should be in the environment is equal to 1. And these are just the probabilities of each one is 1. So I can get this result here. The reason why I need the F11 there is that the S and E may be correlated. In fact, that's what selection is trying to do. Okay? And because both have to be 1, has to be F11 for that term to be there. Okay? So when you do that, that's the growth rate, or the log fitness averaged. And you look at this, and this is positive because that's greater than that. And for the fitness to be maximal, F11 wants to be 1, because that's as big as can be. And then if F11 is 1, you know probabilities, that means that P is equal to Q. So basically, the probability of the environment is the probability of the types in the population. It's not rocket science, but it's a well-known result. You can also see this in the dynamics by basically iterating the fitness and just seeing that the cases where you have E equals to S and E not equal to S have different payoffs. So the thing that is maximized is when the states align, because they would have a bigger factor of this. That's what the evolution will do if you do it dynamically. But you get this result basically directly by considering the average. It would be sort of the eventual stationary point, as you would do sort of in other statistical systems. Okay, so that was simple, but it sees that you want to align with the environment, and the state of perfect alignment is the best solution. Okay. Okay. Now the prisoner's dilemma. Everyone knows the prisoner's dilemma, yeah? Yeah? Okay. So it's introduced sometimes with slightly different notation, so I'm just going to take you through it. So the idea is that two players, S1 and S2, we are S1, so we're always taking the perspective of being S1. Why not? And so, so basically, I'm going to introduce a payoff structure that's all positive, but of different magnitude. So basically, here's the structure. I think you know that basically just means that the best payoff you can get is to defect on a cooperator. That's the W. So you're kind of exploiting somebody. The worst you can have is basically being defected on. And then it's also good to basically cooperate with a cooperator. That's R. And if you defect on a defector, you get L, which is less than R. It's not so good. But the point is that this is stable because it's the best you can do when everyone else is random. And I'll show you that explicitly. So what's interesting is that you now can build a fitness using this that's just in the same spirit. It's an indicator function of the various payoffs. Okay? It's like a discrete probability distribution. And when you take the log fitness, this is nice because it's the kind of thing that people have considered forever in studying the problem of altruism and costs and benefits of cooperation and so on. So the log of fitness of that thing is this, has a constant, and then has minus a cost. There's the parameters here. You see that they correspond to that. Minus the cost of S equals 1, which means I cooperate, plus the benefit of my partner cooperating, S2, and then there's a cross term, okay, when both cooperate. This is what Queller sometimes calls synergism, coefficient of synergism. The word synergism is used in other ways, but just to say, so there's a cost of cooperation, benefit of others cooperating with us, and so it's very simple. And now we can obviously also analyze this. So, okay. So I'm going to say a few obvious things. This is just to get us warmed up. But if the agents are statistically independent, which means that the probabilities multiply, they don't talk to each other, then, so there's P1 and P2, then I can write it simply like this, right? And then I'm just forcing the point, right, just to show you. Then the coefficient of P1 is this. You can massage it a little bit and see. And so C is positive, delta is positive, all this is positive. So this is always positive, there's a minus. So I want P1 to be as small as possible for my fitness to be higher. So that means I defect. I should always defect. So this is kind of interesting because we got this from statistical independence. But this is actually, of course, the Nash equilibrium and the one-shot solution. So you can interpret the one-shot solution as being statistically independent, actually, because it means that the other player cannot fight back, cannot do anything to you, right? It's one shot. So this is just it's just a slight, pedantic perspective on what statistics versus what's often done in game theory looks like. Okay, now there's another situation that's intermediate that's kind of cute because it looks a lot like things that physicists like, which is called, this goes by different names, sometimes called well-mixed population or random mating. And the idea is that the two probabilities actually are the same probability, P. Okay? So that means that, it means a little bit like what you do to somebody else is what they do to you, basically, because we have the same probability. Okay? So then what you get is something very simple. It's just a polynomial second order with a quadratic. And this, if B is greater than C, which is a choice in principle we can make, there's a single maximum, which will be at P equals 1. So full, because benefits of cooperation are always more than the costs, I should always cooperate. But if B is less than C, which is more interesting, then you have a fitness minimum at this value. You can see it immediately. And you have two local maxima at 0, which is defect effect, and at 1, which is cooperate, cooperate. Okay, so that's kind of cute. And because people consider this in simulation as well and so on. So the phase diagram looks a bit like this. So you can build a full phase diagram. It's just that quadratic that we're just working, right? But Jordan made this picture as well. So there's basically, so that quadratic are these orange lines that you see here. And they depend on parameters. So the worst it can get is that, so when B is less than C, there's that fitness minimum. And so what this means is that if you were to start here, the population will be attracted to defect effect. And if you were to start here, the population gets attracted to cooperate, cooperate. Okay, but in between, if you start there though, you cannot come here unless you go through this fitness minimum. So that's kind of the problem. So it's a bit like a tipping point or first order transition. Simple example, but okay. So that's what you get. It's kind of interesting. So there's a way, there's a way to change parameters and so on to create a transition with different characteristics as you go. Okay, yes, sorry.
These fixed points because your population is well mixed, so you're already at a steady state?
Yeah, but it means that if the population started, so you have to pick one set of parameters, but if you pick one, the Bayesian dynamics or the iterated replicated dynamics will take you to this point or to this point. Depending where you start, you're going to end up in different places. So what this says, because as you said, populations are mixed, that's all that can happen. But you should ask the following question. If they were not so well mixed, and if this means also that if cooperation is big enough, even when I have a curve like this, if cooperation is big enough, then I'm on the right-hand side, and I will converge to cooperation.
So the quadratic is if I do the replicator and I'm projecting down to the well-mixed.
Yeah.
And then if I ignore the quadratic, this is what the generic population of I iterate.
Yeah, but it means that even if you had a population that's all defection in one of these cases, and now let's suppose you had some strong local fluctuation, where the local probability is greater than this fixed point, then that part of the system would like to go to full cooperation. That's why it's a bit like nucleating a bubble of cooperation or something. And people have seen this in networks and so on. Okay. I'm conscious of time. I have more or less material, but when should I finish? Oh, should I? Okay. Okay, so the most interesting part, and this is the part, yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Yeah. Yes, I'll show you in a moment. You know, I guess it's one more step of complication, but I'll show you an example that is not too complicated in a moment. But at the moment, so the point here is that for pure game theory, the way to think about it is that the other player is my environment. That's the only thing that, so the role, so this goes to your question before you had an environment that was out there, that was has its own distribution. Now, the thing that's setting my payoffs is what the other player does, right? So they become a little bit my environment. But then you can have the player and the environment. Okay, so I'll do that in a moment. Okay, and this last situation is a bit analogous to task selection. And basically what it does is to express P2. So because now the probabilities are not independent, you can express P2 as a function of P1. So it's basically when P2 is equal to 1 and P1 is equal to 1 times P1, and when P2 is equal to 1 and P1 is equal to 0, probability of P1 equals to 0, which is 1 minus P1, okay? So you can write this in sort of a more suggestive form in terms of this, plus an R times P1. So R is just that, it's this combination, but it's like a coefficient of relatedness. If you think about Hamilton's rule and this way of thinking, this means basically that you see here that this quantity here, if they were independent, the conditionals drop, and this is 0 because they're independent. But you also see they are more related if you both cooperate than if you're misaligned. So this means if this is bigger, then one is 0, the other one is 1. But if this is bigger than that, then they're more related. Okay, so there's sort of, this is the way it shows up here. It's basically how two states can be correlated, and because they're just discrete states, that's all we can do. That's so, but the idea is that this is then, you know, essentially reciprocity of cooperation. This means exploitation, means that I'm going to defect on a cooperator. This is relatedness in some ways. These are words that people use in the literature. And you can think of retaliation or punishment as I'm going to defect on a defector, which is 1 minus exploitation. So these things are related if you think about them in probability like this. It's all very simple, right? So I'm putting words to it. But what you have are these conditionals. Okay. Then the log fitness is just this. And it's no longer a quadratic, but has a coefficient, a bit like in the task selection problem, has a coefficient on P1. So again, this coefficient now needs to be analyzed for what its sign is. When its sign is positive, then P1 wants to grow, and when it's negative, P1 wants to decline. So that's all. So but this is an equation for a line in the F11, F10 plane. So the geometry of this is like a line, like that. Okay, so there's a condition above the line, below the line. Okay, it looks like this. So I'll get to this as more goes to your question. But this black line here is the line for the prisoner's dilemma, which is going to be when the environment is in a certain particular state. So if you're above that line, you have cooperation, and below that line, you have defection. The point about this is that you don't need people to always cooperate with a cooperator. You only need them to be above a certain percentage, which for these parameters is 80%. And you don't want people to never exploit. They can exploit a little bit as long as it's below, you know, the point, as long as you're above the line. So you can have sort of a mixed state that still converges, but that has certain statistical situations where, you know, bad stuff still happens, but it's rarer. And if it's rare enough, people will still cooperate. Okay. So this goes to your question, but this gets, you know, these are steps of greater complexity. So what we decided to do, which is a question that Stefano Alicina asked Brandon, was what if I mixed games, right? If I had the players are playing different games, and these are cued by some state of the environment. You know, when it's sunny, we play Prisoner's Dilemma, and when it's rainy, we play something else. So that's what we did. We did something relatively simple. This is the Prisoner's Dilemma above, as I described to you. And this is a game that I probably I'm wrong about this, but I didn't see what it's called. If you guys know, please tell us. But I'm calling it turn the other cheek, which basically means that you see what gets inverted, right? It just inverts the off-diagonal elements of the prisoner's dilemma, which means now that it's best to cooperate with a defector, so you turn the other cheek, and it's terrible to exploit a cooperator, right? That's the worst you can do. It's just shameful. So, okay, so obviously this game wants you to cooperate, right? Because we stopped a few things wrong. So it's almost a little bit the inverse of the prisoner's dilemma. And so the question we're asking is, how much do we need to mix it in such that actually this shifts the probability of cooperation to become sooner? So in the real situation when Q, which is the probability of the environment, so when Q is 0, you play prisoner's dilemma, and when Q is equal to 1, you play turn the other cheek. But in general, you're playing both, and you don't know necessarily what you're playing, right? Also, you can think of the situation a bit like in task selection, that if you knew which game you're playing, then you know when to cooperate and when to defect. So that's an extreme situation. Then you have to learn that label and have information on that label. So that's an interesting case, but the result is in some sense trivial, because then you do the right thing by each game. So what I'm going to explore is in some sense a simple situation where you don't know which game you're playing, and they're just mixed, they're coming at you, and you just have to decide to cooperate or defect. Okay. So if you do that, it's very simple. I'm not going to elaborate a lot, but what you can analyze the log fitness again, but what you get is basically that the coefficients, the cross coefficients, right? The ones to do with cost and benefit, the C and B parameters, because the D, they're always cooperating and so on. So it's these two parameters actually become dependent on the probability of the environment, right? And then you can write them like this. And so you see again that for when E is equal to 0, you get the prisoner's dilemma, C goes to C, B goes to B. And when E is equal to 1, you get costs and benefits kind of swap. Okay, so now you get this more complicated phase diagram. You get the same idea of lines. So first on the right, you have to be above the line in order to have cooperation. So this is the line for the prisoner's dilemma. But then these lines basically have slopes that change and ordinates at the origin that also change. So obviously, as you mix in the other game, it's becoming more and more favorable to cooperate. And so what you're seeing is that there's more space above the line in each case. But also the mixture of how much exploitation and how much cooperation with the cooperator you need to get to each place is changing in relative terms. That's why the slope is changing. Okay? And when Q is larger than 2/3, then you always cooperate. Yeah. It's a stochastic signal. So it's just each instance, you get either 0 or 1 with probability Q. If the switching of the environment was yeah, if it's deterministic in some sense from the perspective of this statistical machinery, you can still predict it in principle. So you'd have to learn how to predict the deterministic environment, even if it's variable. But that should not, you should eventually do the best you can by that environment. So yeah. Yeah, so this is all about the shocks. What the periodic does to your payoff, then you'd have to code that in a different way. But what this would say is that as long as you're coordinated with that periodic game, then you'd be following the periodic solution, whatever that is. This is very simple, right? It's just cooperation and defection. But you could consider that. Okay. So you get this condition where basically, as expected, as you mix in more, turn the other cheek, then people cooperate more and more. But actually, all the time, you can have both essentially reciprocity and exploitation to various degrees, and it just gets to be more complicated. And this is another perspective on that. So remember that now there are 3 parameters. So this is why it's hard to do in simulations. And this is still very simple. Because now you have a conditional distribution on 2 binary stochastic variables, right? E and S1 and S2. And so that conditional probability has, in general, four parameters, but there's one normalization, so there are 3 things that can vary. So whenever you look at a plane like this, you're missing the other dimension. So what we showed to do here is to have Q, the probability of the environment, versus reciprocity, or here's reciprocity versus exploitation. But you're always missing the other dimension, and so that's why these shapes look different. So again, you see, so you see these various things. This point is this point you see here, and so on. And so this gives you different perspectives on that space. But you can see that this is all derivable analytically. And in fact, the expressions in math, almost the plot is more complicated than the mathematical expression. The mathematical expression is actually quite simple. It becomes nonlinear here because Q appears in a bunch of places and so on. It goes upstairs and downstairs. Okay, so just as a corollary, this process that I showed you for prisoner's dilemma and for turn the other cheek applies, the way I did it applies to every 2x2 game, because I can specify a table, I can specify a fitness, I can specify a log fitness, and then I have to consider the various statistics. But basically, whatever the payoff table is, I can define and analyze a game like this. So that's kind of interesting. So anyway, okay. So now for the final part, just a little bit about selection in groups. So selection in groups brings in a whole other universe of potential interesting things and complications. But so what I'm going to do is basically to write a fitness that now has a G label on top of some I label. I is the individual now, who was the S1 before. And now they're going to be a G label. So this G label could be a layer in a neural network or some other label, right, that says that I belong to a larger group as well. And in general, because all the agents will have labels, so that you'll be interacting with G prime, I'll call it G prime and J. So these are all the neighbors that my GI agent is dealing with. And in general, that's a joint probabilistic state, a really ugly thing when they're all cooperating with each other and they're all entangled and there's a lot of structure, and that's what it is, right? That's the reality of it, probably. But we can't handle that, right? So we're just going to kind of, well, in general, that could be interesting. I've written several papers in the past in different language about discovering what those combinations are, but it's combinatorially difficult. But the point, what is usually done is to assume, I didn't put the condition here explicitly, but it's to assume that these are statistically independent of each other given our focal node. This is what allows you to write a network which is now dyadic, just of pairs. Okay, so this is one simplification to write something that's more amenable, but it's not always true. Sometimes you may want to consider joint states. So that means that if you have conditional independence, this becomes a product over the J and G prime. And so the log fitness now becomes a sum over the logs. So it's more or less the same as before, is that now I have a sum over lots of things, but it's not fundamentally different. Okay, and if I write it again as A, B, C, and so on, I get that the log fitness looks like this. There's a factor of K, which are the number of connections, which is basically the same, almost the same as N, -1. So there are K factors. So I assumed here that that there's a cost per interaction, so there's a factor K there. And then there's a B times all the neighbors that may cooperate, and the D times all the neighbors that could cooperate with me as well. So it's just more or less as before, but this only applies if the neighbors are conditionally independent of each other. Okay, so but this is now sort of a network because it's only dyadic. I only care about my connection to them, at least the NIGO network. Okay, so this can be written, by what you do now is that you put all these sums inside a probability and normalize it. So that's P2. And now you get conditions that are very similar to what we saw before. But what I want to consider is just this to finish, which is that I want to treat the outer group, the people outside my group, differently than the people in my group. So now I can mix the things I showed you before. I can try to cooperate and coordinate with people in my group, but I'm going to treat everybody else as if they're independent suckers out there that I could in principle exploit. So if you do that, then you get an in-group condition, which is more or less what you've seen before. It's just written now with group labels. And you have an outer group where, again, you want to exploit people in the outer group because you don't care. They're likely not to find you, not fight back. This is an assumption. It's just to show you an effect. And so this leads to a condition a bit like this, which is more complicated. But basically, it weighs, you see that it weighs this kg is the number of interactions within my group over all interactions. And so you see that as this gets bigger or smaller, the tendency to cooperate inside the group becomes more prominent or less prominent. And so that's basically what this does. And so what this does is to create a bit of a conundrum that's, I think, interesting. A little bit like the mixed game. If you could recognize that each time that you're dealing with somebody inside your group versus outside your group, you can adjust what you should do. And you should just cooperate the ones you like and not with the other ones. That means that you have to learn that label. You need to, it's a green bead effect or something. You have to know that that person or individual is out or in group. So that's one solution. But the other solution, so otherwise, if you don't do that, what happens is that the out group usually is much bigger, right? There's just more people out there. And so even though you may want to cooperate locally, you're going to be driven to defect because there are a lot of people out there that you could exploit. So that will drive you towards exploitation, unless you kind of become only interacting with your own group. So this is kind of so what this suggests evolutionarily is that if you want to separate local cooperation from exploitation across groups, you need to now have an informational layer that allows me to identify who's in and who's out. Okay, and I have to learn it. I'm not going to show you all that, but that's basically the answer. So the phase diagram for these are that essentially, so again, this is cooperation in the white. If you're above the line. And so when kg over k goes to 1, you're all interacting inside your group. So you get cooperation. These are the same conditions I showed you before. But as you get more people out there that you could exploit and they don't fight back, then you want to defect. And this is another way of seeing it. So the idea then is that you can expand. So you can have sort of a cooperation inside groups. And then in order to expand cooperation across groups, you have to start identifying conditional dependencies, which mean essentially that you have greater reciprocity, less exploitation associated with labels that may not be a label to begin with. Okay, that was sort of my last technical slide. Okay, you can get Hamilton type rules out of all these conditions. It's a bit of a summary, but that's what they look like. They always have a D, this coefficient of synergism, which is something that people like Queller and so on had explored. But in games, this always emerges because there's always the 1-1 state. And then, so just as a summary, evolution can be seen as a dynamical learning process, as well as sort of a metabolic energetic process. So it changes the phenotype that best incorporate data and predict environment grow faster. This, across the population, maximizes information about relevant environments asymptotically as the dynamics goes. And then I think the other 2 points, there are many outstanding conceptual and practical issues that I think are addressed sort of together in the same package by a probabilistic interpretation of population frequencies and this idea of a fitness that essentially is a probabilistic model of the environment. And in some sense, mathematically, it is necessary these things are consistent, but this brings into biology sort of a perspective that that's essentially what a phenotype is, at least from the informational perspective. And then, the average log fitnesses, which are also growth rates, are informational quantities. They tell you about how good on average these matches are. But they're also very convenient for analysis. I hope I convinced you that you can now analyze complicated evolutionary problems and separate independent contributions and even deal with problems of strong selection. So if you open problems, you know how to incorporate noise, which we're working a little bit on, learning rules, which have to do with actually, dealing with these interaction structures a bit more dynamically. There are a bunch of other things. I'm very interested in life history theory and age-structured phenotypes. But anyway, the big picture is essentially, again, going back to the physicist, is this idea that, as these things, these concepts and these methods come together, I think there's sort of a view of a statistical theory that applies across physics and biology that increasingly becomes understandable. That telling us both what's different about biology as a process of adaptation, but also how to think about transitions and other things that are kind of now in different variables, but that necessarily give us a unifying framework for thinking about mathematical methods and theory. Thank you. Yes, there's a question. Yeah, so it was not very explicit in what I talked, but in general, E refers to an external environment. And that external environment is going to have some statistics in some space that you want to specify. I don't know what you have in mind, but you know, whether that's a set of experimental manipulations that set the environment for some gene expression experiment or some other thing, or whether it is just observational parts of the environment, you'd have to code them statistically. That's what this asks for. And once you can do that, you can start doing that. I mean, there are aspects about, you know, your question too is a little bit maybe related to this, that if you look at like something like the weather, right, there it is, crazy now. You know, it's a bit more complicated than what I showed because it's not just a statistical distribution, right? It has dynamics, but over time, it also throws at you independent new things. So you probably need to have a way to think about it in a way that's both dynamical and statistical, and then you can do that. But I think what this also asks for is to try to understand what are, you can turn around and ask for what are environmental states that may drive selection, because not everything will. So what this says is that what are the things that the phenotype really needs to care about and what are things that it doesn't. I mean, the answer in some ways is that definitely things that have to do with energy inflow and metabolism, and then, you know, things that have to do with reproduction, other things. Yeah. Yes.
Memory framework, for example, like if some species will be more quickly adapt to changing the environment, while some others will more slowly adapt, and how one can put that kind of things into.
So there are two things, I think, in your question. One is the question of memory. I mean, there's memory in these populations because they're basically accumulating information, but they still remember things that they experienced in the past as you update the distribution. So there's sort of the states that happened a while ago still matter for what the posterior is, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing is also, you know, whether the update is faster or slower, perhaps. And so in that, you have to see, I mean, I wasn't very explicit about that, but that has to do with a bunch of things. I mean, if you go back to the mathematics of this kind of systems, it depends on how strong the step is for the update versus some other effect. You can control that if you wanted to, but essentially in specifying the likelihood and the steps at which you're updating the population, they implicitly specify how strong the step is. But the step is always stronger if the population is further away, it's more dispersed, has more variance, and it's far away from the ideal state of the environment, and it changes more. When it gets, usually the simplest models, even some of the one I showed you, because they only have selection in what I showed you, they have no transmission error or mutation, then you tend to fixate to the best state. The best state wins and becomes totally dominant. In that sense, the dynamics stops. So that's why the first point there. Yeah. Yes.
You see as the sort of like best case for testing some of these frameworks? And like, does it seem very general?
That's the idea.
That was the idea. But what's your...
Well, you know, people do a lot of experiments in game theory, so you could do that. I think what this tells you to do is to think more statistically through some of these questions. So I think a lot of the experiments and simulations sometimes are very literal. They consider very specific situations instead of statistics. So there's a question about that. But yeah, I mean, this predicts phase spaces and convergences and so on for whatever fitness model you come up with. So if the fitness, I mean, all these are testable: task selection, game theory. You can do experiments with people and sometimes with other creatures. But the point, I think the point to take home is that if you have a situation that experimental in mind, you just have to figure out what this fitness function would be for that. If you control the rewards, you know what that's going to be, and if the states are discrete or continuous. And then you can basically see if the dynamics reproduces what you observe. It's very general, but that's where the specificity goes in. You would have to, you would have, no. You'd have to probably measure that, but what you really need to do is how the state of the environment, if it comes up different, affects your payoff, right? And that's sort of building the likelihood function. So that could be many different things. And in fact, we should think about evolution. I wanted to say this, so forgive me, I didn't say it, but you know, it's just another general point, is that these likelihood functions, what I showed you, are all very shallow. But you know, but now we use this language of deep networks, right? So essentially, because they're conditional distributions, they can be very deep, just like we're doing in machine learning and so on. You can condition all kinds of things that may be hierarchical and so on. It's just that they become internal things and the model gets bigger and so on. But presumably that's a bit what's happening, and we know how to do this through graphical models and so on. And so the idea is that once you have one conditional distribution, you can keep going. There are lots of things that you could go with that. And in some sense, that is also what we do in any statistical learning problem. So, but in specifying what the problem is and what's that fitness function and whether some fitness function families are better than others, there's a lot of work to be done there.
Spatial situation.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So that's not in this.
Well, this is a little bit abstract. You'd have to say what migration, you know, what does that look like? Are these populations? So in all I showed you, you had populations that were competing to describe a certain environment. If a population migrates out of this environment,
You could do that as a
yeah, yes, it is. So you could, if a population somehow is better adapted to a different environment, it should migrate there. And as it migrates there, we'll also adapt to that environment, as it's known in speciation. So, you know, there are lots of things like this, but it's telling you that this informational part, which is generative, really should be there. And I think this shows you a bit how to do it. So I'm sorry if that was not specific enough, but in some sense, you always need to specify the fitness model. Yeah. All right. Thank you.